Hello. You have accessed Renegade Files, your underground connection to paranormal events, unsolved mysteries, and deep cultural analysis. Welcome to the weirdness. I'm your host, Lex Gordon, coming to you from the Jungle Villa Outpost, deep in the uncharted tropics. This is Renegade Files, episode 121, When Myths Materialize. The Rake, Mermaids, and Doppelgangers. As children, most of us probably had at least a few experiences of fear in a dark room at night. As you stare, the clothes in your closet take on hideous shapes of specters. Close your eyes and things only get worse. Ghouls, demons, and devilish beasts beset you. It seems we come pre-programmed with these images. Monsters who travel across the collective subconscious to populate our nightmares. The more we try to look away, the worse they become. This can be particularly troubling for creative kids with vivid imaginations. And the only advice we're given? It's not real. It's just your imagination. Go back to sleep. But even as Albert Einstein told us, imagination is more important than knowledge, because every invented and created wonderment of the human world has been first born in someone's imagination. This ability to imagine is the ability to conjure. But when we, as a species, share perennial, unexplained experiences, we tend to place these in categories that occupy a higher place than mere imagination. This lofty realm of the paranormal is called myth. And myth is not the same thing as fiction. A myth is a functional, thematic summary of the extraordinary, the transcendent, and the supernatural. Myth is not, as Western science might describe, a primitive attempt at explanation, but rather, it's the very narrative of a complex interrelationship between our societal paradigms and the unexplainable experiences that shape them. And in this shadow realm of myth, there be monsters. What happens when the creatures of myth step across the veil and into our everyday waking lives? Join me now to find out, as together we embark on a most harrowing expedition into the shadow realms where myths materialize. The Rake, Mermaids, and Doppelgangers. Part 1. The Rake. From the witch in Hansel and Gretel to the slender man of modern suburbia, all cultures and societies have multiple myths focused on a diabolical creature who preys upon the innocent. One of the original myths, which has served as an inspiration for many of these monsters, is known as the Rake. The Rake gained a new audience as a favorite of internet forums and modern online folklore, but the legendary Rake has a long history that goes back centuries. One of the first written accounts comes to us from a mariner's log, with this entry written in 1691. Quote, "He came to me in my sleep. From the foot of my bed I felt a sensation. He took everything. We must return to England. We shall not come here again at the request of the Rake." End quote. And this one, from a Spanish journal written in 1880. "I have experienced the greatest terror. I see his eyes when I close mine. They are hollow, black. They saw me and pierced me. His wet hand I will not sleep. His voice, the rake. And one more, a terrifying note written in 1964. I feel it necessary to assuage any guilt or pain I have introduced through this act. It is not the fault of anyone other than him, for once I awoke and felt his presence, and once I awoke and saw his form. Once again I awoke and heard his voice, and looked into his eyes. I cannot sleep without fear of what I might awake next to experience. I cannot ever awake. Goodbye. And another note in the same wooden box. Dearest Linny, I have prayed for you. He spoke your name. So, even in just these three examples, we see a trend. The rake coming at night, seen when waking. A monster first felt, then seen, then heard. It is said that once the rake sees you and you see him, he will follow you the rest of your days. These could be said to be the ramblings of the mad, but we're talking about ages apart. 1691, 1880, and 1964. Pastor and author Robin Swope from Erie, Pennsylvania, who is also a seminary-trained exorcist, tells us that the legend of the rake can be traced back as far as 4,000 years to ancient Egypt. The god of the underworld, Osiris, was said to cause fear among the living, because Osiris was not just the custodian of the afterlife, but he was an active predator, much like the Grim Reaper. Osiris was also the god of rebirth, renewal, vegetation, and fertility, so not all bad, but it was his dark nature as the harvester of souls that people feared. A parallel to the rake, perhaps, but the rake, by all accounts, is more of a lesser demon, more bent on fear and destruction than the renewal that comes after. So, let's get into some of the more detailed descriptions from those who claim to have seen this creature. One Catholic boarding school student who snuck out after dark to meet her boyfriend in a park tells us the two were overcome with dread as they saw a crouched human-like figure in a tree line. In the shadows cast by the streetlights, the figure stood to an abnormal height, 8 to 10 feet tall, with long arms and spindly twig-like fingers. It watched them, moved toward them, and reached out its grotesque hands. They were frozen in fear, unable to move, scream, or process what they were seeing. Just then, a teacher walking his dog came near, and the dog barked, causing the creature to run in enormous bounds away into the darkness, leaving the students hiding and thinking they may be losing their minds. Exorcist Robin Swope says that the rake has the ability to blend into its surroundings with its long, gangly shape, able to assume the appearance of twigs and trees, particularly at night. He also says the rake has been described as having the ability to extend living tendrils from its back, like flexible, strong vines or twisted branches, but under the monster's control, the tentacles of a giant, land-bound monster. Now remember, the legend says once the rake sees you, he will torment you forever after. Well, it seems this is what happened to our Catholic schoolgirl. Her name is Carrie Forgorgia, and today she owns a tattoo studio in, once again, Erie, Pennsylvania. But after her first encounter with the rake on her sneak-out sojourn, she tried to put it all behind her. Sometime later, while still in school, she was asleep on the bottom bunk in her dorm room with no one on the top bed. She awoke fatigued, but not from any nightmare or vision. She was short of breath. She felt someone's gaze and looked to one side to see that it was one of her roommates, staring down at her from the top bunk across from hers, but with a face frozen in terror. The roommate told her that she had awakened at 3:30 a.m. and seen Carrie writhing in her bed as a dark shadow monster of enormous size, 8 feet tall at least, with long frail limbs, crouched over her and smothered her with his terrible clawed hands. The roommate was terrified and couldn't move or scream. It was only when Carrie awoke and sat up that the creature fled in silence from the bed and vanished into thin air at the end of the dorm. Not knowing what else to do, Carrie and her roommate went to the boarding school principal and told him the story. They had no idea what to expect, but to their surprise, the principal took their report very seriously. The next day, when Carrie and her friend returned from class, they ran into a Native American medicine woman who had been brought to the dorm by the principal. She was saying prayers, casting sage smoke, and rattling a string of shells to offer a spell of protection for the girls. Carrie felt that a Catholic school going to such an unusual pagan extreme was evidence that more was going on there than her two encounters. And, sure enough, when she started asking around, she found out that other students had similar experiences with the rake, and that this was something that had plagued the school for decades. Carrie packed up and went home for Christmas break that winter, and she never went back to school. She says that she has never seen the rake since, but the memories continue to haunt her. If you believe in digging deeper and keeping the paranormal alive, then join me at patreon.com/renegadefiles. There's a link in the show notes. You can try it out totally free for a whole week and become an RFA agent today. Thank you. If you're already an RFA agent on Patreon, you make this show possible. Part 2. Mermaids. Not all mythical creatures are terrifying, some quite the opposite. And while some mermaids might have a treacherous side, I think most people would choose them over a rake any day. One thing that I've always found interesting about the mermaids of myth is how matter-of-fact so many of their encounter descriptions have been over the centuries, and we'll get into some specifics, so stay tuned. On our previous show about the USOs, we touched briefly on the parallels of that subject and the history of mermaids and sirens when we got into Part 8, Ancient Sea Traditions and Modern Parallels. So go back to the last episode and check it out if you haven't, and share it with your friends if you listened to it and liked it. The easiest way to share it is just send them a link to therenegadefiles.com and tell them to check out episode 120. But this time, we're going to go much more in-depth on the subject. Okay, don't worry, I'm not going to start that again. Right? He who would pun would pick a pocket. Mermaids are not one single legend, but a long-running family of water-being traditions that have merged over time. Near Eastern fish goddesses, Greek sirens, Celtic and Northern European nymphs, Japanese ningayo, and later, sailors' tales. One of the earliest ancestors of the mermaid tradition is the Syrian goddess Atargatis. Classical and later sources connect her with fish, fertility, protection, and sacred water. She was primarily a fertility goddess and her appearance evolved into a fish-bodied female over time. Not that every later mermaid story comes from a Targetus, but she is one of the oldest major figures in the background of mermaid lore. The ancient Greek tales, get it? All right. Okay, sirens. The Greek sirens, they made an appearance in ancient stories. And in many of those legends, the siren actually had the body of a bird instead of a fish. But the Greek stories migrated into Europe, and through trade and travel, these ideas kind of blended so that the sirens became synonymous with mermaids. This idea was spread to audiences in a big way with Homer's Odyssey, where sirens were depicted as dangerous creatures that lured sailors to their doom with their enchanting songs. Odysseus is able to successfully navigate past them by having his crew block their ears with beeswax and having himself tied to the mast so he doesn't succumb to the siren's temptation. From there, the mermaid found her way into the medieval Christian bestiary traditions, which moralized them as figures of lust, temptation, and spiritual danger. So the medieval Christians are always using animals as metaphor in their stories. The Greek story of mermaids singing beautiful songs to passing sailors from atop reefs was sort of hijacked by these early Christian churches and spun into stories of warning about following your lustful impulses, right? But not all mermaids are always dangerous. The folk traditions in Northern Europe often gave water women a more mixed role. Dangerous, yes, often, but also prophetic, fertile, healing, and sometimes even helpful, guiding sailors through treacherous waters, helping them avoid reefs, that kind of thing. In Celtic and North Atlantic tales, the mermaid is often less a single being, but more part of a wider class of water creatures. In the academic folklore article, To Hear the Mermaid Sing, Visual Figuration, Myth, and Desire in the Case of the Water Woman by Louise Milne, she outlines a broad family tree of supernatural aquatic women, sea and river nymphs, marine goddesses, water monsters, and folklore water beings. The beings that make up this family tree play different roles depending on their native habitat. For example, in Ireland, an important figure is the Merrow, Merrow. This is a recurring feature of tragic Irish folk tales and later Irish literary imagination, where the Merrow is tied to coastal danger. It's also representative of the difficulties of marriage across vast distances, of beauty, enchantment, and loss. So in Milne's article, it shows that medieval northern traditions treated water women not as pure villains and more as ambiguous beings tied to occult power, fertility, help at sea, healing, and prosperity. This is far closer to the old pagan texture of water lore than the purely moralized church versions of sirens as modern temptresses to sin that we get in the medieval ages. So Irish folklore is seen as sacred, and in this view, it has helped keep mermaid belief alive all the way into the 20th century. A 1938 school book from County Clare describes a mermaid at Newhall Lake as half woman and half fish. Beautiful, golden-haired, and combing her hair on a rock, she is seen wearing a magic cloak, and any human who should try to steal the cloak would become bound to her forever. So this is classic folk structure, beauty, dwelling at the edge of normal experience, a magical garment, and the danger of crossing between the land and the water, between the human and the fantastical worlds. Another Irish story presents the mermaid as a death omen. When a sea maiden is seen combing her hair on the shoreline rocks once again, beside her are treasures, pearls, shells, sparkling gems. Her appearance foretells a drowning or a disaster at sea. This is very old maritime logic. The sea can give you wealth, but it can also take your life suddenly. Mermaids become a warning of the sea's dangers. In Scottish traditions, we find the Selkie. Selkies are seal people who remove their skins to become human. In supernatural beings in the far north, folklore, folk belief, and the Selkie, writer Nancy Castle McIntyre tells us that traditional Selkie ballads are often centered in Orkney and Shetland, while the broader tale-type mermaids come from the stolen skin marriage story. So this is a tale where a man hides the seal skin of a beautiful Selkie so he can marry her. Years later, the wife finds the skin, puts it back on, and returns to the sea, but her decades ashore cause her to retain her human torso, and the seal skin transforms her legs into a fish tail. This story is often told in variations, but it's always one of the most haunting marine legends of the northern Atlantic. Across Europe and beyond, mermaid beings multiply under local names and with different bodies. German traditions have the Nixies. These are water sprites who lure people by beauty and music once again. Medieval and continental Europe preserves a being called the Melusine. This is a split-tailed or serpent-tailed female associated with noble lineage and ominous transformation. This is where we get the Starbucks logo. The British Museum collection identifies a late medieval badge of the legendary siren Melusine, showing how firmly this mermaid was embedded into medieval imagery. Moving over to Japan, we have the Ningayo. This is more of an uncanny human fish creature, as opposed to the more beautiful Western mermaid. The Ningayo is associated with immortality, calamity, and omens. Seafaring communities, both ancient and modern, are ideal breeding grounds for mermaid beliefs. Maritime historians note that sea folklore is as old as seafaring itself, shaped by isolation, danger, storms, unfamiliar animals, and the vastness of the ocean. Mermaids worked as explanations, warnings, omens, and fantasies all at once. We've all heard the stories that many mermaids were likely sightings of marine mammals like manatees. That's one lonely sailor. But Smithsonian historians have noted that Christopher Columbus's mermaids were almost certainly manatees. And mermaid reports by sailors were often later explained as manatees or other related sea mammals. In fact, manatees belong to the order biologically of Sirenia, and this is a scientific name that actually comes from the old myth. So let's dive into some specific mermaid sightings. Christopher Columbus, while sailing near the Rio del Oro along the coast of then Hispaniola in 1493, made a journal entry that described him and his crew seeing 3 mermaids rising from the sea. In 1608, Henry Hudson on his ship Hopewell, sailing in Arctic waters, recorded a mermaid sighting in his journal on June 15, 1608. This is a very famous one. The captain described the creature as having the torso and upper body of a beautiful woman and the tail of a porpoise, but the tail was striped and spotted like a mackerel. Very specific. He named the other men who saw her as well. This is one of the classic shipboard mermaid entries made by a known explorer at a specific location. Then, in 1610, Richard Whitbourne in St. John's Harbor in Newfoundland made one of the strongest early English language mermaid reports. He described a strange creature in the harbor that he identified as a mermaid of captivating and alluring appearance. His account greatly contributed to the folklore surrounding mermaids during the early 17th century. A lot of fringe lists repeat that Blackbeard actually marked waters on charts to avoid because of mermaids there. But Pirate History Analysis notes that there's no solid proof that Blackbeard kept that sort of logbook, and the claim appears to be fabricated or at least extremely poorly sourced. And as much as it would be really cool if we could find any documents to prove that he did this, it probably belongs in the modern myth built on reputation category instead of the actual documentation category. But by the 18th and 19th centuries, mermaids shifted from oral records into written accounts and soon into actual objects like exhibits, taxidermy fakes, curiosity cabinets, and modern commercial spectacles. The Natural History Museum notes that Japanese craftspeople manufactured thousands of cryptozoological specimens for sale to European tourists. These included fake mermaids made from taxidermized animal parts. You know, the old monkey skeleton with a king salmon tail bit? We all have one of those on the wall in our office, right? The most famous example of one of these monstrosities is the Fiji mermaid, popularized by P.T. Barnum in 1842. A monkey head mounted on a fish body. The importance of the Fiji mermaid is not whether it was real, but that it blurred the line between popular science, spectacle, colonial collecting, and monster belief. In other words, it helped create the modern evidence exhibit style of mermaid history. Modern mermaid belief is still very active. It's usually a mix of folk legends, tourism, and local spiritual belief. In Israel, the modern legend surged in 2009 when repeated reports led the local council to offer a $1 million reward for proof of a mermaid. That's a perfect modern case. Rumor, witness clustering, media amplification, and municipal branding all sort of blending together. In Zimbabwe, mermaid belief remains powerful enough that in 2011 and 2012, irrigation and reservoir work reportedly stalled after workers claimed that mermaids were present near the dam sites. ABC reported that attempts to install pumps near the area halted after sightings were reported and a traditional healer was called in. Across cultures, mermaids and related sea beings usually center around the same symbolic jobs. They mark the boundary between land and water, human and animal, desire and death. They represent the magic and wonder of the sea, but they also foretell drownings, treacherous storms, and forbidden desire. Sightings have been documented in journals by respected and sober sea captains. But despite centuries of stories, no official physical evidence seems to exist. I may have said this before, but in the end, mermaids are just so cool that you kind of want them to be true. And there is room in this world for such a sentiment. It's part of what makes the world so fun. And now, we leave the seaside and our frolicking mermaid friends behind and step into a hall of mirrors where unexplainable doubles come with uncanny motives. Visit the Renegade Files shop through the merchandise link in the show notes, represent your paranormal prowess on the street, and help this indie show thrive. In a world of corporate media, go grab some Renegade Files gear. Thank you. Part 3. Doppelgangers. A doppelganger is a mysterious double or exact look-alike of a living person. Unlike an ordinary twin or unusual resemblance, a true doppelganger in folklore is often considered a supernatural apparition, an omen, a shadow self, or a duplicate that appears independently of the original person. The word doppelganger is German and it means double walker. It entered wider European usage in the late 18th century through German literature and several Romantic-era ghost stories. In paranormal belief, seeing one's own doppelganger has often been interpreted as a warning of death, a sign of illness or mental distress, a spirit body temporarily separated from the person, a dimensional duplicate or a time slip version of yourself, or an omen of a major life change. In psychology, many doppelganger experiences are now linked to hallucinations, sleep disorders, neurological stress, dissociation, or what had previously been called multiple personality, and also mistaken identity. Belief in doubles is ancient and appears across many cultures. In ancient Egypt, the Ka was considered a spiritual duplicate of a person that could survive after death. In the pagan Norse tradition, the Vardögr was a spirit predecessor. People might hear or see someone arrive before the real person physically showed up. In Celtic lore, stories describe fetches or wraiths. These are apparitions of living people seen just before their death. And in the German Romantic era, the modern doppelganger concept was solidified. So this was in the 1700s through, I guess, the middle 1800s in German literature, where the double began to symbolize hidden guilt, divided identity, madness, and fate. Writers like Jean Paul helped popularize the term. So let's get into some famous doppelganger cases. The first three are historical accounts, and the last one, a modern day story that took place right here in the uncharted tropics. First up is the famous story of Catherine the Great's double. This royal doppelganger legend claims that in 1796, several servants saw Catherine the Great, the famed Empress of Russia, sitting on her throne while the real Catherine was elsewhere in the palace. The servants knew Catherine was attending a function, so they alerted the guards, who believed some impostor or thief was in the Great Hall. The guards rushed in, saw the apparently living figure on the throne. She looked identical to Catherine. Same clothes, same hair, and same face, although her expression was distant and seemingly in a sort of trance. She rose to her feet when they entered, and the guards would later describe her as stilted and moving in odd ways, almost like a puppet as she stood. Then, in front of their eyes, the figure faded and vanished. Very soon after this episode, Catherine the Great died. Because of the timing, the story became a classic example of the doppelganger as an omen of death. Then, we have the apparition of poet Percy Bysshe Shelley in the early 1800s. The poet Shelley reportedly told friends he had encountered his own double. He was at a home in Italy when he walked out onto the terrace for some sun and air. At the end of the patio, he saw a man with his hands on the rail, and he was struck that he was wearing the same clothes and hat as he was. The man then turned, and Shelley froze, confronting a person who was his exact double. The twin started walking toward him on the terrace, but transformed into a mist and blew away on the wind. His wife, Mary Shelley, also saw the doppelganger on other occasions. Not long after this encounter, Shelley drowned in 1822 while sailing. This case became one of the best known to tie a literary figure to a doppelganger. There's also a story of Abraham Lincoln seeing his double next to him in a mirror, but this was some time before his demise. I think the White House staff also saw his double walking through the halls while he was asleep in his room, and this was just before he died. Which brings us to perhaps the most famous historical account of a doppelganger, Emily Sage and the classroom double. The case of Emily Sage is often cited as not only one of the most famous, but one of the strongest and strangest doppelganger stories ever recorded. These category-defining designations have been agreed upon for years because this case involved multiple simultaneous witnesses, repeated appearances, and a setting where events, Especially events concerning the behavior of teachers and students were documented. A private boarding school. According to the classic story, Emily Sage was a French woman employed as a newly arrived teacher in 1845 at a girls' boarding school called Pensionnat von Neulich, located near what is now Latvia, but was then part of the Russian Empire, near present-day Jelgava. So this is the second famous historical doppelganger coming out of Russia. Emily Sage was described as intelligent, refined, attractive, calm and competent, and she was said to be 32 years old. Nothing about her mannerisms ever suggested instability or a predilection toward any kind of fraud. By all accounts, she was a normal and respected teacher who was liked by both students and staff. But then things started to get strange. One day, while she was teaching, her students were disrupted when the classroom door opened and another teacher walked in. While this would have been rare, it wasn't necessarily unheard of, but anytime someone came into a working classroom, it usually meant something was going on, and girls at a boarding school in the Victorian era would have been eager for any kind of event outside of their daily routines. But the students quickly realized that Miss Sage seemed to either not notice the visitor or was too wrapped up in her writings on the blackboard to stop lecturing just yet. But then the students were shocked to see that the visitor looked exactly like their teacher. Same clothing and appearance, like a twin. In fact, some thought the teacher must have a twin sister that they didn't know about, and they waited to see the two greet each other, but that never happened. The students watched in confusion as their teacher went on teaching as if no one was there. And the eerie double walked slowly to stand beside her. The doppelganger began to copy her gestures, moving when she moved, and sometimes she looked less solid, wobbly, or faded. Witnesses said the real Miss Sage seemed suddenly tired or drained in this moment. Then the doppelganger walked awkwardly and slowly back out of the classroom door, having never spoken. When she was gone, their teacher resumed her normal energy and was mystified by the burst of questions from the now rowdy girls. The school became abuzz with rumors of a ghost or a witch, and the teacher had a conference with a few other staff members, and they all agreed together that this was simply a matter of excitable students with vivid imaginations exercising a sort of misguided creativity. But just a few days later, the doppelganger returned. This time, the students were inside their classroom sewing as part of their activities for the day. As they did so, Miss Sage was seated in her chair in the classroom. The students noted her acting in a peculiar manner, staring into space as if in a trance. Meanwhile, outside in the garden, some other students saw Emily Sage picking flowers in the garden path. Students in the garden were familiar with the event in the classroom, and they knew that Miss Sage was supposed to be in her class at the time, as some of their friends were in the same sewing session that day. The girls in the garden watched the Emily Sage double and realized that she moved strangely, at times floating, and at other times stumbling. After a few moments, two brave girls approached the figure. They spoke to the doppelganger, asking, "Who are you?" But there was no response. One of the girls reached out to touch her shoulder and said that what she felt was the fabric of the dress, but not a person in it. The soft yielding down of a stuffed doll. She said it also felt unusually cold. The girls stepped back in horror and watched the figure stand, look at them, and then vanish into mist. roughly a dozen other girls all saw this happen. As the story spread throughout the school, and concerns began to arise about student safety and sanity, Emily Sage admitted this strange phenomenon had followed her through multiple teaching posts. She had worked at 18 schools in 16 years, leaving each time her doppelganger would arrive and generate fear among students and parents. Much of the story was popularized by paranormal author Robert Dale Owen in his 1860 book, Footfalls on the Boundary of Another World. Owen obtained the story from a woman named Julie who had attended the school, and while there are no confirmed official school archives proving the incidents as described, the story has appeared in other locations which also provide former students as sources. Believers have suggested several paranormal explanations, including biolocation, whereby Sage unconsciously projected herself to other places, the etheric double, which is an energy body created through witchcraft and separated from the creator's physical form. Another idea is that of crisis projection, where stress causes psychic exteriorization. And finally, we have the concept of haunted attachment, where a separate intelligence is mimicking a living person. The Emily Sage doppelganger story combines group witness testimony, Victorian paranormal culture, and the psychology of rumor. Skeptics remind us that boarding schools are classic environments for contagious belief and rumor, and that once one sighting is spread, later ambiguous moments are seen through that lens. Also, that a dramatic story is always embellished over years of retelling. But unlike many paranormal stories involving one frightened witness, this account involved dozens of schoolgirls seeing the same phenomenon, which puts it in a unique category and is part of why paranormal researchers have kept the story alive for well over a century. Moving into this century, in fact, the early 2000s, near the uncharted tropics, as it were, but in the city of Oviedo, Florida, which is northeast of Orlando, a woman named Kim Leggett and her two daughters had a most unsettling string of experiences. It started when the two high school-aged daughters were getting ready for school one morning. The younger girl, Tana, was accusing her older sister, Jordan, of taking her hairbrush. Jordan denied it, and a bit of bickering ensued. Not an unusual morning for teen sisters getting ready for school, I would imagine. Soon the brush was found, and the girls were off on the bus and headed to school. Their mother, Kim, was having coffee on the couch when she saw her youngest daughter, Tana, walk by in the hall. Wearing a robe with a towel wrapped around her head, she exited the house through the front door, and the mother jumped after her, yelling that she had missed the bus, but she had to go to school no matter what she was up to. In the front yard, the daughter was nowhere to be found. The mother worried, but never got a call from the school of Tana's absence, as would have been the case, so she assumed that Tana had made it to school somehow. When the kids got home that day, Kim confronted them, but both swore that Tana had ridden the bus to school and been there all day. After this, things got weirder. Jordan awoke once to find her sister Tana standing silently over her in bed, walking awkwardly around the room and saying nothing, then leaving, only to find Tana the next morning vehemently denying such behavior. Once, the family was watching a movie together in the living room when all three of them were horrified to watch what looked exactly like Tana, same clothes and hair, walking from the hallway through the living room, where they were all seated, and into the kitchen. When the three burst into the kitchen, no one was there. Once again, when Tana was at school, the doppelganger Tana showed up at the house and was trying to get in through the front door. At first, the mother thought it was her daughter, but when she looked through the window in the door, she saw this Tana had black eyes and a ghostly, featureless face. She knew intuitively that this was not her daughter. She left the door locked and went to call the police, but before she reached the phone, the doppelganger forced the door open with a slamming shoulder and entered the house. She walked down the hall and stumbled into the bathroom where she vanished. Days later, Tana arrived to open the pizza shop where she worked on the weekends. She was the only one there setting up the place and waiting for the other staff to arrive at 11 a.m. when the shop would open. She heard a noise in the kitchen and assumed the manager had arrived early. When she went to see, she found a cleaver stuck in the cutting board and a mess of crudely chopped tomatoes splattered and dripping from the counter. She called the manager's name and ran from the kitchen to the front door, but no one was there. She was scared and decided to leave and come back when the shop opened and others had arrived. But the front door was locked and her keys were hanging on the back wall hooks in the kitchen. She needed them to unlock the door and to drive home. Cautiously, she made her way to the kitchen doorway to grab them. When she rounded the corner, terror. Beyond the counter of dripping tomatoes, and at the far end of the kitchen, near the pizza ovens, stood her exact duplicate. There, head slightly down, hair falling over her face in places, then looking up with black eyes and a blank expression, was her mirrored self. Same work uniform, same black ball cap, standing, silent, motionless, and in her right hand, the gleaming cleaver. Tana had had enough. "Leave me alone," she screamed. "Go back to hell forever, or come and get me right now." With that, the specter walked forward. Tana stood her ground. Another step closer it came, and with a third step, vanished into mist. Tana grabbed her keys, fled to the door, and drove home, exhausted. According to her and her family, she has never seen her doppelganger again. But she is always fearful that it could reappear at any time. Doppelganger stories endure because they combine several deep human fears: loss of identity, fear of replacement, death, loss of control, and uncertainty about reality. All of this makes the doppelganger one of the most psychologically powerful of all paranormal archetypes. A doppelganger is not merely a look-alike, but a supernatural duplicate of a living person. Across history, it's been feared as an omen, spirit projection, or sign of death. And the famous cases have cemented the legend into that rare category of paranormal lore where myth steps physically into reality. To step deeper into the world of Renegade Files, join the Renegade Files agency on Patreon and become an RFA agent today. You can check out our Patreon page for free at patreon.com/renegadefiles, or just tap a link in the show notes. And for less than you tip a server for a single meal out, you can get bonus episodes and days of other cool content that I've made for you there. Thank you so much. If you're an RFA agent already, you make this show possible. And jump in there. I'll be so glad to see you. Thanks. My summary. So, Myth, in the broad context, is more than a human explanation reflex. It's a thematic summary of the extraordinary, the transcendent, and the supernatural. Myth is our story of the complexities between societal paradigms and the unexplainable experiences that live within them. The examples we covered today, the Rake, Mermaids, and Doppelgangers, are three paranormal archetypes that have developed reputations for evolving beyond the pages of fantasy and arriving, corporeal, in the world to move among us. Maybe always on the fringe, or edge of wakefulness, reality, or just beyond the very land itself, but somehow always there in a physical way that lives outside the borders of make-believe. Can you catch a mermaid, a rake, or a doppelganger? Perhaps no. But can you catch smoke in your hands? And if you cannot, does that make it any less real? Thank you sincerely for investigating When Myths Materialize, the Rake, Mermaids, and Doppelgangers with me. Subscribe or follow this show right now so together we can meet here next time and explore the deepest covert stories of UFOs, aliens, hauntings, cryptids, conspiracy theories, and unsolved mysteries. I am thrilled to have you in the Renegade Files crew. You have listened to this episode up to this point. You like the work I do, making these shows for you. So tap the Patreon link in the show notes now. Do that. And come check out everything I've made for you there, and I will see you inside. Until our next adventure, I'm your host, Lex Gordon. Stay wild, runaway child.